Hi KRV teachers, welcome to the Maximinds Being the Best Version of Yourself webinar series. Today we are focusing on student boundary setting and how to help you to set clear classroom expectations. A reminder of the overall webinar series, and today is our last webinar in the module focusing on your relationship with students. Starting with the introduction, what are we learning about today? Hopefully, I will assist you with practical ways to set firm and clear boundaries both inside and outside the classroom. We'll start with an overview of boundary setting and provide some context. Then we'll look at 4 different types of boundary setting strategies: clear expectations, adopting an authoritative teaching style, positively reinforcing your students, and then finally involving parents. Starting with boundary setting. Boundary setting is defined as implementing limits and constraints to safeguard the emotional, physical, and mental well-being of yourself and also your students. It's often defined by what is acceptable and unacceptable in your relationships. Boundaries need to be set in relation to many things, but in this case, for you as teachers, in relation to students' behaviour and also in relation to their students' academics. For behavioural boundary setting, this might look like praising pro-social behaviour, but also providing repercussions for anti-social behaviour or bullying. Academic boundary setting can involve things like rewarding homework completion, but also detentions for incomplete homework. To provide you with some context for boundary setting, did you know that more teachers are wanting out? 2 in 5 new teachers are planned to leave the profession within the next decade, and many teachers leave the field of education within their first 5 years. As we've looked at in a previous webinar this series, one of the reasons why teachers are leaving is the inability to manage disruptive classrooms. Another reason is the inability to set student boundaries, which is why we're learning about this today. Setting boundaries has obviously become more challenging as flexible learning continues, particularly because of COVID. It's gone not only from online, in-person to online, but it's now this hybrid model of in-person and online. We have increasingly more distracted learners because of the various sorts of things and tools and data information that students have access to. Obviously, social media plays a huge role in that and the rise of technology. And we now have a new generation of learners. Where we had Gen Y and Gen Z before, which were categorized as millennials, we now have Gen Alpha, who are just starting their high school years in typically year 7 and 8. While millennials have a learning style which is typically more interactive and multimodal, Gen Alpha are more virtual. While millennials are more influenced by peers and forums, Gen Alpha rely on things like chatbots. And while the millennials have typically a longer attention span, are less distracted, Gen Alpha have a shorter attention span and are typically more distracted. And finally, millennials have been known to be less creative compared to Gen Alpha, who are more creative and typically have more diverse and inclusive mindsets. So to summarize all of these things, the final importance of boundary setting is to help teachers and students to develop a healthy and respectful educational relationship. So how can you actually set boundaries, and what are the strategies that I'm going to show you today? We're looking at 4 strategies today. How can you set clear expectations, adopt an authoritative teaching style, positively reinforce students for good behaviour and desirable behaviour, and finally involve and engage parents more. Starting with clear expectations. We have looked at this before, but to remind you, clear expectations are comprehensible and easy to understand and student tailored. And they're also specific goals, outcomes, and end products that you expect. It does involve a partnership between you and students to work collaboratively together. And it does remove the guesswork and helps to empower self-autonomy of your students. There's many types of different expectations that you probably already have, but some of them can include things like arriving to class on time of students, helping each other out, not running indoors, working collaboratively, completing homework on time, behaving peacefully, not talking over others, treating others with respect, and following instructions. So how can you actually set these clear expectations? Most importantly is to actually communicate the outcome. Then you can collaboratively goal set with the students and help them to break down the outcomes into specific tasks and steps where needed. So starting with communicating the outcomes. As we looked at before, the two different types of boundary setting can involve behavioural and academics. From a behavioural perspective, this would be looking at expected types of behaviours, such as the KRB Sacred Heart values. You may also have different behaviours which are expected in your particular classrooms, which are good to consider as long as they're communicated and made articulated to the student and made clear to them. There is, of course, academic behavioural expectations. These some come from, of course, NESA and BOSTES, and they outline specifically what are the student outcomes. Surprisingly, more students than I think and that I come across aren't aware of their specific syllabus, particularly in the early years, but really using those outcomes that you're expected to teach them, make them aware to the students so they also know what's expected of them from an academic standpoint. Once you're aware of the outcomes and you've communicated those, collaboratively set goals. So these can be behavioural and/or academic, and SMART goals is the preferred method, and these are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Once you've understood together what the goals are, then it's about helping to break them down to specific tasks and/or steps. Thank you for someone who volunteered the feedback and question in the previous webinar response that said, well, what happens if students refuse to engage? And this could be including things and they're not prepared to come to the party with your expectations. Well, going back to boundary setting and what it is, firstly, it's to try and help also protect you and your own emotional well-being as well. Remind yourself that you are only in control of what you can do and say, and not that of students. Motivation is something that's obviously very hard to teach, and ultimately it has to come at some stage from the student. So do remind students that their behaviours are all choices that they have, but they will have to come to terms then with the short and long-term consequences. And we'll look at this and how you can implement this when we look at the next section on how you can help adopt an authoritative teaching style. But before that, if you can please grab your worksheet, I'd just like you to write down one way that you can establish expectations in your classrooms. So moving on to an authoritative teaching style. As mentioned, for those students that aren't willing to engage in your expectations, then exerting a level of authority or dominance can be helpful here. We have looked at the various teaching styles before, but a reminder that there is an axis of control versus warmth, and authoritative teaching style has both high control and high warmth, and it is and has been found to be the most effective teaching style to use in the classroom. Excuse me. This level of high control and dominance, but also high warmth, is effective by being firm but fair, having that control and dominance, and also the warmth and rapport. This might sound like saying things like, well, actions have consequences, but also I'll take your perspective into account. So setting up your own rules, genuinely seeking and valuing students' feedback, expecting them to participate in discussions, collaborate amongst students, but also then assign consequences if they do fail to meet those expectations that you have set and that you've set together. I would like you to again grab your worksheet, please, and write down one way that you can adopt an authoritative teaching style. So, further to that particularly high level of warmth that we see in an authoritative teaching style, positive reinforcement has been found to be the most effective type of way to administer and deliver consequences to different actions. A bit of background, it comes from operant conditioning, which is a theory of learning where behaviour is influenced by its consequences by adding or removing stimuli to increase or decrease behaviour. There are 4 different types of behavioural responses, and we have looked at these briefly in a previous webinar series, but to remind you, they are about taking away or adding stimuli to either decrease or increase desirable or undesirable behaviours. To give you an overview of punishment, punishment is to try and reduce a certain behaviour happening, and you can achieve this by taking something away in the case of negative punishment. So, for instance, taking away the phone in the classroom so that they aren't able to be distracted anymore. But it also can be involved in adding something, as in the case of positive punishment, when you can add something such as constructive feedback to also to reduce undesirable behaviour going forward. On the flip side, reinforcement ultimately tries to increase desirable behaviours, and this is the most effective generally compared to punishment. You can take something away in order to increase a desired behaviour, which is negative reinforcement. So this might be, for instance, taking away free time to increase the likelihood of studying instead. But most effective is positive reinforcement, which involves adding something to increase the desired performance or behaviour. So, for instance, this might be providing a reward or token for successfully completing homework. I can't stress this enough that the most effective form of a behavioural modification is positive reinforcement. So it's about adding something to increase desired behaviour. This might look like praising good behaviour in the classroom. It might be using a token reward system to congratulate homework completion, or it might even be something as simple as thanking students for their effort. Your best bet is to use positive reinforcement, even in light of disruptive behavioural challenges, classrooms, different diverse learners. Behavioural reinforcement is always the most effective way to increase the likelihood that they will meet your expectations and perform in the way that's desired. So I'll just give you a moment to please bring out your worksheet again. And I would like you to write down one way that you can positively reinforce your students in the classroom. And finally, parental involvement. Quite self-explanatory, but this is really encouraging parents' participation in the education process and experiences of their children. And this can include things like discussing school activities, imparting those aspirations and expectations and boundaries that you've already set up with students upon them, so they're across them. Supervising, getting them to supervise and learn, help with their learning at home. So really to almost outsource that and have that collaborative way to teach students and ensure their education is advancing in the desirable way. And of course, contacting them. That is something that tends to be underestimated, the power of having communication, quick emails where possible, picking up the phone to be more proactive has been found to be far more advantageous than reacting. So how to involve them? As we looked at last week in the Diverse Learners webinar, understanding their child's learning history, styles, disorders in particular. The key things you want to know here is how do they have any, or what personal circumstances do they have which may impact their performance in the classroom. So really understanding and learning about it, because awareness is always the good first stage. Proactively communicating, emphasis on proactive, because as mentioned, proactive communication via quick emails and phone calls is much more advantageous in helping to maintain those boundaries that you set and helping students to meet those expectations. Far more advantageous than reacting to them after. Sort of like what we looked at with positive reinforcement, that is far more advantageous than the punishment in the same sorts of ways. Being on the front foot is always best. And finally, using those parent-teacher nights to your advantage. Obviously, that's an opportunity for you in a more formal setting to sit down and provide them with feedback on their child's performance, but also giving them quite specific homework for them to go away with and think about, and to help you with your job in the classroom to ensure that they are also working towards the boundaries and expectations that you're expecting at home, just like what you're trying to do in the classroom. So using those to your advantage to really outsource that. I'd like you to finally grab your worksheet again and write down one way that you can and will commit to involving parents more in the future. And to summarise today, hopefully you learnt that boundary setting involves implementing limits and constraints to safeguard not only your emotional, physical and mental well-being, but also that of students. They can be set in both behavioural and academic situations. One of the primary reasons why teachers leave the profession has been found to be due to that inability to set student boundaries. Flexible learning arrangements and environments, increasingly distracted learners and new generation of learners also make boundary setting very challenging for you as a teacher. So what can you do about it? There's 4 different types of boundary setting strategies that we've looked at today. Clear expectations, having an authoritative teaching style, positive reinforcement and parental involvement. Clear expectations involves communicating the outcomes, collaborative goal setting, and breaking outcomes into specific steps and tasks. Adopting an authoritative teaching style involves being firm but fair, having control and dominance over the classroom, and exerting warmth and rapport. Positive reinforcement involves adding something to increase desired behaviour and is the most effective type of behavioural modification. This might include things like praising good behaviour, rewarding homework completion, and even thanking students for their effort. Parental involvement involves understanding their child, proactively communicating, and also using those parent-teacher nights to your advantage. As always, if you need any resources, here are your emergency contact details. You also have access to various strategies, quizzes, articles, videos, activities, and the option to refer a student to a psychologist on Maximinds. And you can use the promo code KRB 2024 for a free trial access for a term. If you do have any further questions, comments, feedback, thoughts, please do reach out. Here are my contact details. I enjoy hearing from you, so please continue to do so and look forward to seeing you again next week.